Hello, I'm here with Dr. Patrick O'Keeffe, author, along with Angelika Papadopoulos of the Australian Government's Business-Friendly Employment Response to COVID-19, a critical discourse analysis. Patrick, thank you very much for your time.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So there's a really nice, clear story at the heart of this paper, which I think can be communicated pretty quickly. It goes, the Australian government's response to the employment crisis that was caused by COVID-19 has rested on a claim that entrepreneurialism and flexible work, really meaning gig work, is necessary for the economic recovery. And this is justified on the grounds that business needs to be flexible in order to be productive. The outcome of this, apart obviously from the failure to provide a more substantial support package for the frontline victims of the employment crisis, the people that have lost their jobs, is to deepen what you claim is an already existing conflation of public interest with business interest. And this has been happening by a number of Australian governments. So I guess my first question, unless you want to clarify anything I've just said, my first question relates to a really obvious, I think, illusion that occurs in this discourse, which is the move from business needs to be flexible in order to be competitive to workers need to be flexible in order for businesses to be competitive. And I was just wondering, is this an illusion that occurs explicitly in the discourse, or is it just an unstated, taken for granted sort of thing?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think in some cases it is quite explicit. And in some cases it is almost sort of framed as something which is to be assumed as like a common sense idea. So in terms of it being quite explicit, we could refer to Scott Morrison's speech to the National Press Club in May of 2020, where Morrison is talking about Australia's economic recovery in the wake of the economic crisis created by the coronavirus pandemic. So in this sense, Morrison is talking about the need for a very sort of business-focused recovery. So talking about reshaping different parts of Australian society, different parts of the economy in terms of what's in the best interests of business. So in that sense, seeing the needs of business as being the broader needs of the society. And I think one of those needs, or one of those maybe ambitions, is for a more flexible workforce. And we see this in the discussions around employment relations specifically, and potentially we could see the Omnibus Industrial Relations Bill as being an example of that, where we're looking at maybe a shift towards a more flexible workforce in the interests of business, in the proviso that this is going to help support Australia's economic recovery, which Morrison very much frames as being delivered through businesses' capacity to be profitable. So makes this argument that business profitability will lead to employment growth, which will lead to this emergence from the economic crisis that was created by the pandemic. But we could also point to other examples which are maybe not so recent, where there has been a very specific focus here on encouraging employee flexibility, and almost framing this as being a trait of the modern worker. As I think as we move towards more casualised work, and as we have moved towards more casualised work in the past 20 to 30 years or so, but we're also seeing the emergence of digital technologies, which in a lot of cases are making this flexibility more possible, and maybe also operationalising that flexibility as well. So there are explicit examples that we could refer to, but in a lot of instances, it is almost framed as being that common sense idea that the employees need to be more flexible to support businesses to be more profitable.
That's really interesting. I guess for a long time, I was thinking in that answer, I was thinking, well, it's really just an economic story which focuses very closely on business at the expense of what's going on the labor side. But we do have a few stories developing about what's going on the labor side. Really interesting to just say, well, this is the nature of the modern worker. That is a natural move. That is a standard move of creating taken for granted knowledge, creating doctor knowledge. You place the use of this discourse, this discourse of the connection of flexibility with productivity within a trajectory of Australian governments have also over recent years leaned into the rise of the gig economy as something that's good for the economy as a whole. Is that consistent across a lot of recent governments, or are there exceptions where governments have pushed against these ideas?
Yeah, well, I think that's really interesting. I think that if we're thinking about recent Australian governments, particularly in the past 8 or so years of the Liberal National Coalition government, that's a very consistent theme. And we could also refer to examples of state governments, or at least authorities connected with state governments, who have also been making that argument. And as I've referred to, the Jobs for New South Wales report, which is cited in the paper, is an example of this. I think it's quite interesting in the sense that if we look back over the past 25 years or so in Australia, in a federal sense, 19 of those years we've had a Liberal National Coalition government in power, and we could definitely say that there's a consistent theme running across those 25 years in the sense of the development of this idea of employee flexibility as being fundamentally a good thing for the economy. And I think that potentially what we've seen in more recent years is a more direct focus on that connection. And we could even refer to, I guess, the early years of the Abbott government, where in some cases Abbott is almost positioning the Australian society as consisting of businesses and consumers, and in that sense, the employee or the worker is, I guess, almost like an absent figure in a lot of that discussion. So we're talking about what's best for the interests of business, what's best for the interests of consumers, and the interests of the employees are not given as much airtime in that framing. And I think that one particular challenge for whichever federal government might be successful in the next federal election is being able to push back against those ideas. And as we highlight in the paper, it's not just government that is at the heart of this story, but also influences on government. And we've particularly referred to papers that have been published by McKinsey Australia and the McKinsey Global Institute as well, which are very much focusing on flexible work and flexible employment, or gig work, that they're sort of referring more so as independent work, as being, I guess, a fundamental aspect of working life now, but also into the future. So on the one hand, you've got policy making, but on the other hand, you've got this broader apparatus of influences which can very much shape that policy making as well, which have been speaking very specifically in terms of flexible employment as being fundamentally good, not just for that economy and that society, but also for individual workers themselves. Talking about the flexibility that might provide workers and I guess specific types of workers as well.
Yeah, I mean, certainly these ideas are contested in a lot of the spaces that you and I might be reading, working in places like universities where there's these strong discourses of the costs of flexibilization and casualization. I guess I was really just interested in the possibility of contesting these discourses for, say, a Labor government. To put it in a more pointed way, are there alternative discourses of how Australia could grow out of the pandemic that are sort of waiting in the wings as the clear alternatives? Is there a Labor-centric plan that you're aware of, or anything like that?
Yeah. Well, I think we could refer to the concepts of meaningful work and quality work, and there has been, I guess, recent reports emerging which have, almost equated, quality work and meaningful work with better economic outcomes as well. So I think that there is definitely this sort of counter idea out there and the possibility to resist these narratives of flexibilization and casualization. So that
Yeah.
I would suggest the potential is definitely there. Yeah.
Yeah, it exists. One of the things I was going to ask you about is the confluence of this discourse with another problem, which is being spoken about by a state agency in the RBA chief's insistence that wages need to rise. You keep saying like they need to rise materially, but in order to get back to a 2 to 3% inflation band, we need to have wages rising at 3 to 4%, which is say more than the growth of the economy. And is there, well, first of all, do you think there is a problem with these two claims, with that claim alongside this discourse? And secondly, does that pose a problem for the government, do you think? And is this a space that could be focused on by critics of this discourse?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Particularly in relation to that last question, or the last part of that question. So I think that there, while we're seeing this sort of this idea of flexible work as being very much dominant at the moment in terms of as I've referred to with Scott Morrison speaking about the need for flexibility to enhance business profitability and so on. So that's this particular idea that's out there at the moment, which has a lot of traction with the current federal government. But also, what we're seeing is that meaningful work and quality work and work that can provide people with a stable income is good, not just for that particular person, but it's actually good for the society as a whole. It's good that people have money in their pockets because obviously that's going to be related to economic activity occurring out there in the community and supporting those businesses which Morrison is referring to. So I think that there's a lot of potential there to pick up on those particular ideas, not just in a social sense or in a sense of supporting individual workers and collectives of workers, but I think there's also a really strong economic argument that could be made, which could say, well, if we're going to look at an economic recovery, why don't we look at a recovery that's I guess structured in the sense to support people who are working in that economy to enable that economic recovery to occur. So I think that there's a lot of potential in that particular space. Yeah.
I guess, and as a final question, I don't know if it falls within the purview of your article, which is of course a critical discourse analysis, but I guess framed as a discursive question more than a question about the state of the world. My last question is about the rise of the gig economy itself and how you're understanding it. This is something we're all interested in, certainly something we're publishing a lot on at the Economic and Labour Relations Review at the moment. And I was just wondering if you understand the rise of the gig economy as another step on a trajectory towards an individualized employment market, say a few blocks on from something like work choices, or are we looking at something qualitatively different here that we need different tools to understand?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Potentially you could answer that in a number of different ways. And potentially you could say, well, this is sort of the natural trajectory of what we've seen throughout the 1990s and the 2000s. I think what I think is really interesting, and what potentially could lead me to think a different way, is the sort of emergence of these digital technologies and how that's sort of changed how people are speaking about work, or how policymakers and organizations like McKinsey are speaking about work, and how these digital technologies and these platforms are very much enabling maybe a more extreme operationalization of that flexibility of employment. So I think one of these really interesting ideas that's developed in that discourse that we speak about in the paper is not only the focus on gig work and independent work, but also the fragmentation of jobs itself and the outsourcing of different parts of jobs, you know, to different workers, whether they be employed in Australia or internationally. And that's very much made possible by the emergence of these digital technologies and platforms, which is quite interesting when you, and as we sort of focus on in the paper, this sort of reconceptualization of employees as needing to be flexible very much occurs hand in hand with the emergence of this sort of digitization and the capacity for remote work. So in some cases, the digital technologies are sort of enabling a sort of more hyper flexibilization than maybe what might have been envisaged previously. So whether that is something new altogether, I'm not entirely sure. But but for me, looking at some of the documents that we've studied in this paper, it sort of very much enabled a sort of conceptualization of a future of work, which was, you know, potentially not quite achievable, you know, 15 or 20 years ago, and potentially with the coronavirus pandemic and the requirement for people to be working remotely, we might have seen that future, you know, made possible maybe a little bit earlier than had previously been envisaged as well. So I think that's also quite an interesting development, and how you know, the coronavirus pandemic and the economic crisis has in some ways created the possibility for the federal government, for instance, to sort of reshape you know, different parts of Australian society in the interests of business, but also has enabled this this sort of more remote way of working, or this more flexible way of working, to I guess become more fast tracked than might have previously occurred.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I agree with a lot of that, and I think it's a conversation we're obviously going to continue having. So yeah, I think there's some really good contributions there. Well, that was all I had. Thank you so much for your time. I really think this is a great paper. I think it's a very valuable paper to lay out the moves this discourse makes, valuable analytically, but also I think it has a lot of potential to be valuable politically. So I really hope it's widely read. The article is by Dr. Patrick O'Keeffe and Angelika Papadopoulos. It's available at the Economic and Labour Relations Review. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael.